How regional banks lost their edge. They once knew every street, every business, every borrower by name. They were faster than giants and closer than regulators. Then, almost without notice, their advantage disappeared. For decades, regional banks formed the backbone of American finance. They bridged local economies and national capital. They translated personal knowledge into lending decisions. And for a long time, that made them remarkably resilient. To understand why regional banks struggle today, we need to return to the moment when proximity stopped mattering. Because the same forces that reshaped them are still at work now, quietly redefining what survival means in modern banking. Originally, regional banks thrived on information. They understood seasonal cash flows. They recognized trustworthy borrowers without complex models. Judgment mattered more than scale. This gave them an edge larger institutions could not replicate. Decisions were faster. Relationships were deeper. Risk was assessed through context, not abstraction. Regulation reinforced this structure. Limits on expansion protected local competition. Geography created natural boundaries. Banking remained fragmented by design. But fragmentation began to feel inefficient. Technology reduced distance. Data promised objectivity. Scale promised consistency. Gradually, lending stopped being personal. Credit scores replaced conversations. Models replaced memory. Risk became something calculated, not observed. At first, this seemed like progress. Standardization reduced bias. Automation lowered costs. Regional banks adopted the same tools to stay competitive. But those tools changed how decisions were made. Local nuance lost weight. Exceptions became harder to justify. Judgment gave way to thresholds. As markets integrated, capital flowed differently. National banks accessed cheaper funding. They spread risk across regions. They absorbed shocks local banks could not. Regional banks responded by growing. Expansion became survival. But growth demanded conformity. Processes standardized. Cultures shifted. What once differentiated regional banks now looked inefficient. Personal knowledge slowed decisions. Local exposure increased volatility. Intimacy became a liability. Slowly, the advantage inverted. Scale protected balance sheets. Diversity diluted risk. Size began to matter more than insight. Yet the system still treated regional banks as distinct. Expectations remained local. Support mechanisms did not scale equally. Pressure increased. This was the opening tension. Regional banks were caught between worlds. Too large to remain purely local. Too small to benefit from national insulation. And the gap was widening. The squeeze intensified as banking entered a new phase. Efficiency became the dominant metric. Margins narrowed. Every institution was measured against the same benchmarks. Regional banks faced a structural disadvantage. They paid more for funding. They held more concentrated portfolios. They lacked the diversification scale provided automatically. To compete, they adopted national strategies. Loan products standardized. Risk models imported. Balance sheets optimized for metrics, not relationships. But imitation erased differentiation. Regional banks stopped being unique. They became smaller versions of national institutions. And smaller versions absorb shocks less easily. Technology accelerated this shift. Digital access removed geographic loyalty. Depositors no longer needed proximity. Money moved with a click. This changed behavior overnight. Deposits became mobile. Stability depended on confidence, not familiarity. Regional banks lost their most reliable anchor. At the same time, regulation grew heavier. Compliance costs rose. Reporting demands expanded. Fixed expenses weighed more heavily on smaller balance sheets. Large banks absorbed these costs effortlessly. Regional banks felt every addition. Efficiency gains struggled to keep pace. Margins tightened further. To offset pressure, risk profiles crept upward. Yield became necessary. Concentration increased quietly. Exposure grew in familiar sectors. Local expertise still existed, but its value was no longer rewarded. Markets priced assets the same everywhere. Nuance was flattened. Meanwhile, public perception shifted. Safety became associated with size. Smaller institutions felt optional. Confidence consolidated upward. This perception fed behavior. Depositors chased perceived stability. Liquidity flowed toward scale. Regional banks lost flexibility. The system reinforced itself. Success attracted deposits. Deposits enabled resilience. Resilience attracted more confidence. Regional banks were left balancing precision without protection. They understood their risks. But understanding no longer reduced vulnerability. It only clarified it. This was the early conflict taking shape. Not failure, but exposure. Not collapse, but imbalance. The kind that waits for stress to reveal it. The conflict became visible when stress finally returned, not as a system-wide collapse, but as selective pressure. Some institutions bent, others broke. Regional banks discovered their problem was not mismanagement. It was positioning. They carried concentrated risks without concentrated protection. Precision offered no shelter when confidence moved faster than facts. When uncertainty appeared, deposits reacted immediately. Digital access turned concern into action. Outflows accelerated before explanations could follow. Speed replaced deliberation. Local knowledge could not slow withdrawals. Strong relationships could not compete with instant transfers. Trust, once built over years, could vanish in hours. The advantage of proximity dissolved completely. Meanwhile, national banks absorbed the shock. Diversification muted impact. Liquidity buffers functioned as designed. Size acted as insulation. This divergence reshaped perception permanently. Stress confirmed assumptions. Large meant safe. Small meant vulnerable. Regulators responded with targeted measures. Support arrived where pressure peaked. But interventions reinforced hierarchy. Protection scaled with perceived importance. Regional banks now faced a brutal reality. They were expected to operate like large institutions, but without equivalent tools or equivalent margins for error. Efforts to adapt intensified. More hedging, more standardization, more consolidation. But each adaptation moved them further from their original strength. Local responsiveness weakened. Cultural identity thinned. Risk awareness remained, but influence shrank. The system offered only two paths: grow large enough to matter, or remain small enough to fail quietly. Neither preserved the original model. The space in between disappeared. Regional banking lost its strategic footing. This was no sudden collapse. It was erosion, slow, logical, and structural. And once erosion becomes visible, it is usually too late to reverse. The climax was not a single failure. It was a realization spreading quietly across the system. Regional banks had not lost relevance through mistakes. They had lost it through design. The environment no longer rewarded closeness. It rewarded insulation. Scale provided time. Diversification absorbed shock. Speed favored those already protected. Regional banks still understood their communities. They still saw a risk forming before models detected it. But insight without buffers could not stop withdrawals. Knowledge no longer slowed momentum. The system had changed its priorities. Stability was no longer built from the ground up. It flowed from the top down. Confidence followed size, not judgment. This altered the meaning of resilience. Survival depended less on managing risk, and more on how quickly support would arrive. Being important mattered more than being careful. For regional banks, this was a breaking point. They were expected to remain prudent while competing in an environment that punished restraint. Their edge had turned into exposure. What replaced them was not better banking. It was banking optimized for perception, for scale, for manageability. The loss was subtle but profound. Local economies lost intermediaries who understood nuance. Credit decisions became more uniform. Risk spread differently, not necessarily more safely. Today, debates focus on oversight and capitalization, but the deeper issue remains structural. A system that rewards size over insight will always pressure institutions that specialize in understanding. This is not the end of regional banking, but it is the end of the world that made it powerful. And the consequences of that shift are still unfolding. So what do you think? Are we repeating the same mistake again? How